The Sufi poet Rumi advised us to sell our cleverness and purchase bewilderment. This quotation is highly fitting today as we realize that the familiar ideas about public communication and crisis communication no longer fit in a very complicated world with compelling hybrid crises. Today, our panelists will talk about new ideas for addressing hybrid crises. Each panelist brings a slightly different focus. Deanna Selnow focuses on learning before, during, and after crises. Mark David has a focus on corporate crisis communication. Stephen Vanette will take an organizational communication perspective on crisis communication. And Karina Buzanyahnu will talk about social media and its function in crisis communication. I'll ask several questions, and each panelist will respond in order. Beginning with our first question, complex crises of a hybrid nature create a need for communication on several fronts simultaneously. Based on each of your research and experience as crisis communication scholars and consultants, what are the communication needs or priorities for addressing multiple stakeholders in a single crisis? Deanna?
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. I also want to thank the Directorate of Communications for inviting me and being such gracious hosts. It's been a pleasurable experience so far. In matters of risk and crisis, we often encourage working together as diverse communities of practice to engage in decision-making based on a shared repertoire we develop together through dialogue, and then to manage competing narratives as they erupt and evolve, coming from a variety of sources and across multiple communication channels, including interpersonal, public, mass, as well as legacy and social media. But in the case of hybrid crises and hybrid threats, however, it's more complicated than that. And this is due in part to what we sometimes refer to as a power over relational dynamics and diverse cultural perspectives and competing cultural values and norms that are involved and inherent throughout them. In these cases, I believe we must turn to the theory of mutuality, which focuses on putting the interests of all stakeholders, communities, and wider society at the forefront of communication. In other words, our discussions and decisions must prioritize human, social, and environmental implications. We must set our sights on and then not lose sight of our goal, not for power over, but for the creation of shared and lasting benefits across all stakeholders and groups. This is challenging, to be sure, but also necessary. Communication in hybrid threats is not just a tool, but it is the fuel that drives it. Thus, we must prioritize communication that respects how one is affecting the other and being affected by the other. We must be receptive to our impact on as well as impact of others. And finally, to do so, we must intentionally lay aside either or and us-them thinking and framing of the narrative, which fuels this ideological polarization. Communication matters. We must instead ground ourselves in our communication in an attitude of mutuality to seek and find common ground that will ultimately lead to long-term, sustainable decisions that prioritize our common humanity through mutuality as we strive to peaceably coexist in our global risk society.
Mark?
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for this invitation to the Directorate of Communication of Turkey. My research has led me to understand and identify many key elements and important challenges for communication in time crisis in Canada. For the matter, I will only name a few here. First, the expertise of strategic planning communicators must be clearly established, especially when implementing communication action to respond to the crisis. For example, I noticed during the COVID crisis that many public health experts and public authorities have given themselves decision-making powers in strategic communication and de facto relegating communication professionals to the technical level. For me it's one of the biggest challenges. Second, already complex, because we're talking about complexity here, already complex when the internet arrived a few years ago, let's say 25 years ago, communication has become more complex with the fragmentation of traditional, we could say legacy media, and means of communication, different kind of means of communication. However, it has become even more complex with the arrival of algorithm used in social media. For most communication strategists, understanding algorithm has become a major issue, not to mention the arrival of the artificial intelligence, which has completely revolutionized digital communication strategy. I can even say it's a disruption in the strategic communication environment. Third, I consider that the major challenge in crisis communication remains the detailed understanding of the stakeholders and particularly the most vulnerable audiences. I think for me it's the elephant in the room, but I will take about that matter a little bit later. Fourth, in a crisis context, a challenge for communicators, is to simplify for a French one, it's very tough, this one. Increasingly complex messages. For example, how can we explain in times of a pandemic to citizens the scientific difference between a traditional vaccine and the new RNA vaccine, which have been proven to be most effective? So that's a very difficult task for a strategic communicator to communicate clearly and simply to vulnerable audiences. In this sense, the important challenge for communicators is the creation of simple, reassuring, clear, understandable, and above all, actionable message of all audience affected by a crisis. Finally, despite all these levels of complexity that I have just mentioned, I have noticed a trend towards hyper-simplification of communication process by authorities in times of crisis in Canada, also in WHO. So, in that, to conclude, it's a shortcut to simplify process complex. For me, it's the biggest challenge overall. Thanks.
Very good. Stephen.
Well, first, I want to share my fellow panelists' appreciation for this meeting and an opportunity to share some thoughts on this very important topic. And the first question, asks about how to engage different stakeholders during hybrid crises. And I think in this context particularly, it's important to recognize that a single message approach is likely to not be effective. And so my advice would be to design artistically coordinated multi-message campaigns. And so that the messages have similar themes and similar ideas, and they're well coordinated, but they allow different people to take in information that meets their particular needs. And no one message can do that job. And so we want to create an environment where different stakeholders, different audiences have access to quality information that they can trust and that they can select information that most meets their need at a particular time. A benefit to using artistically coordinated multi-messages is that it decreases the stress during a high-risk environment to segment audiences and to do research about what their information needs are at that particular time. That work needs to be done before a crisis happens. But during those complex times, it's important to try to reach out with a very broad perspective that allows different people to have access to information.
Karina.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. I would like, first of all, to say thank you for inviting me and thank you for being here, and congratulations for the organizers. This is such an excellent event and enriching experience for all of us. Following on what Stephen just mentioned, I would say that, and I would invite us all to reflect on something. And this thing is the fact that today we don't only have new types of crises, but we have new types of audiences. And this is an important change that we all need to consider, having in mind the emerging social media platforms and what social media has been doing to our lives, to our societies, to our economies, and so on and so forth. What we do know is that in social media and in social media in crisis and crisis communication, we have more questions than answers. We do have more questions that we need to address and we need to work more. But what I think it's very important for us to reflect on if we are addressing the appropriate questions in terms of what is social media's role in crisis and why do some events are being transformed into crisis and why others, like emergencies, are somehow left behind. There are many things we don't know about social media's role in crisis, but what we do know is that social media empowered publics and empowered audiences as never before. We now see that audiences and publics that were ignored in the past, that were left behind, that were silent, step in conversations and address topics that they have no knowledge, they know nothing about, but they feel empowered in having a voice and in reaching out to other people and letting them know what they found out. This is social media's role, and it's something that we have to address, and we have to be very careful whenever we organize and we respond to crisis and to specific situations. What we also know is that these people that have been somehow left behind and that have a voice now today within social media, they are very vulnerable in confronting with disinformation, and they are being targeted. And it's important to have this in mind whenever we organize crisis response and we address them. I'm sure that during the COVID-19, you were all very much aware of the fact that there were new types of audiences stepping in and new types of stakeholders having a clear idea of what was going on without having a solid knowledge and solid information. In Romania, we used to say during the COVID-19 pandemic that we gained 2 million of health experts who recently graduated Facebook. Imagine today how many experts we have all over the world graduating TikTok. And these figures are really threatening our societies and the way that we are running our lives. And getting back to your question, Tim, I would say that what is very important, and following what Stephen just mentioned, what is very important is to tailor the messages indeed, but to create content that is relevant for local communities, going local and addressing smaller groups, having in mind their interests, their expectations, their needs and their fears, rather than addressing the general public or larger audiences.
Good. Let's shift directions and talk a little bit about disinformation. To what extent do you believe that disinformation has increased the complexity of crises, and what advice would you give practitioners for addressing disinformation? Start again with Diana.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to reiterate what one of the panelists said this morning. Disinformation is not new. Disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, and even hate speech have been around for a long time. What has complicated matters, however, is the speed at which these messages can be manipulated and spread through artificial intelligence and social media channels. And so that's the piece that I think we need to address. And I'm going to turn to one of my mentors, South African activist and former president and Nobel Peace Prize winner Nelson Mandela, who said, "Education is the most powerful weapon we can use to change the world. And it is our responsibility to use communication to effect positive change toward peace, and through two kinds of education of our youth. One is in digital media, information media literacy, and the other is by training our young people to become solutionaries. And solutionary is not my term. It is a term that was founded by co-founder and president of the Institute for Humane Education, Zoe Weil, in her book, The World Becomes What We Teach. And she said that we need to do the most good and the least harm by solutionary thinking. A solutionary is someone who brings critical, systems, strategic, and creative thinking to bear on pressing and entrenched challenges in an effort to create positive changes that don't have unintended negative consequences on anyone, human or inhuman. And so I believe that to address this social media speed at which this is happening is through education of our youth in digital and information literacy and solutionary thinking.
Okay. Mark?
Thank you, Tim. For me, the most significant impact of disinformation is that the other information that is that it offers information that undermines the notion of trust in society. And this notion of trust is the anchor of it's a social cement of a function of a good function of society. And this trust is also the heart of communication process, and particularly in time of crisis. So for me, it's a matter of it's a vital element to keep in mind with the speed that Diana just mentioned. The aim of disinformation is essentially to destabilize the public opinions of certain stakeholders. It's not a matter of reinforce the quality of life, it's to destabilize, to create a notion of chaos in a certain matter to the benefit of obscure parties, or I won't say stakeholder, but foreign entity. Therefore, the challenge for communication or strategist communicators essentially consists of quickly identifying sources of disinformation, which are particularly difficult to identify, especially if they come from foreign sources, as I mentioned. And with as you mentioned, Diana, with AI, the artificial intelligence and algorithm, as I mentioned earlier, it's key element, but it's very, very difficult to identify those sources. So, in that matter, most often, when we finally manage to identify the sources of disinformation, if we can, the crisis is over. So what we do in that matter? In this context, strategic communicators must prepare for a crisis by proactively managing possible risk in AI, key messages, countermeasure of foreign sources, and identify possible contradictory messages so they can react as quickly as possible in time of crisis. But it's a big, big challenge.
Sure. Stephen?
Well, I certainly agree that disinformation is becoming more complex over time, not only because of the speed of information exchange, but also because of the reach and also the hybrid nature of the communication and the complex campaigns that people are promoting. I think as practitioners, it's very important for us to recognize the economics of information that exists today. And I would describe it as a problem of commodification of information. In other words, people are manipulating information not just for their cause, but also for economic gain. And that also adds to the complexity of the problem that we're facing. So what do I mean by commodification and economic game in this context? Well, we know through our history of social media, how short it is, that people used to post messages and sit back and wait for responses. But then some people found out that they could use specific strategies that we oftentimes identify as clickbait, where they could really draw attention to their messages. Well, now we're discovering that with disinformation campaigns, not only are they posting messages and using those strategies to draw attention to their messages, but they're actually encouraging people to respond and react to those messages, sometimes by posting information that they know is obviously wrong, because then people want to immediately react by correcting that information. But every time that somebody reacts to the message, the algorithms recognize that as an interaction that's taking place. So it's an exposure to the message and an interaction, and both of those drive the algorithms to push that message out to more people. And so now those strategic strategies of posting not only a hidden disinformation campaign, but an overt campaign can accelerate the spread of that information. And so, in essence, people who are savvy in disinformation these days are posting their messages, they're enjoying the chaos that's created in that communication environment, and then they sit back and cash the check that they get from the different social media platforms. And I would say that such economic conditions reinforce the idea that disinformation is a wicked problem. And I think the best way to identify that this is a wicked problem is by asking the question, is disinformation the source of the problem, or is it the effect of the problem? And clearly in this case, we have to answer that it is both at the same time, which is a hallmark of what a wicked problem is. And so to address these complex communication environments, we have to be equally complex, equally savvy in how we strategically respond, and we have to take into consideration the strategies that people are using.
Very good. Karina.
I don't know what I could add after Stephen, but I would, just picking up from his comment, I would just say that it's vital for all of us to understand the business model that is behind the social media platforms and to address the interests of the shareholders of the social media platforms whenever we want to really get to the bottom of talking and finding solutions for disinformation and for what social media is doing for disinformation. And now getting back to the question that Trim addressed, I would kindly ask us all to acknowledge that disinformation has changed our lives, has changed our societies and our economies, but has definitely changed the way that peace looks like today. And that we have a new concept of peace that we really need to think about. And disinformation also has done something, has created a very thin border between peace and war. And I don't think it's a mistake acknowledging and saying that today fighting disinformation is one of the most challenging and difficult tasks that both communication scholars and practitioners have. And why is it so difficult? And all the arguments that Stephen just mentioned are crucial in having in mind whenever we want to address this issue. It is also very difficult because disinformation draws on people's fears and insecurities, and they go to the bottom of their fears and of their problems, of the way that they feel left behind in some societies. And they mix factual information with false data and with false information, and they do all this by creating new realities and new perceptions. And this is extremely dangerous because they build upon anti-establishment discourse, and they're doing this by asking people to lose their trust and to express their resentment and to increase resentment and frustration among people and societies. And again, why it is again very difficult is because unlike official communication and institutional communication, disinformation uses tools and techniques that are not available for public communication, and they pick juicy topics, and we all know that in order for an event or a topic to spread, it needs to be appealing, it needs to use memorable images, it needs to tell a story, an emotional story, and to trigger feelings in people. And dissemination does this in an excellent way. It's doing a great job in actually using all these things. And getting back to the question, I would say that, and following what Diana just mentioned, I would say that a key solution to all of this is increase people's resilience through media literacy skills. And as far as I'm concerned and looking on the data that is available, at this moment, I don't think we can hope of a clear regulation to fight disinformation in social media. But what I think we can do is to give people, empower people, as social media did, but empower people with media literacy skills and help people be equipped and prepared in order to spot disinformation or fake news, to fact check, help people fact check information, and give them the power of having these tools and letting others know what they just found out. Thank you.
Very good. Given all that we've discussed so far, our last question focuses on dialogue. Specifically, I'm wondering what your recommendations are for achieving an inclusive dialogue toward crisis recovery, resolution, and resilience. Deanna?
Great, thanks. I think that one of the unintended, perhaps, consequences of having 24/7 access to technology and social media is what Sherry Turkle in her book Alone Together talked about as social isolation and alienation among each other. We've lost some of our ability to relate interpersonally. And so when I think about the question that you just asked, Tim, I would say that we need to come back to the core of what we know communication is. And effective communication is both speaking and listening. And perhaps listening is the more important part. And so I turned to Jane Goodall, and when she said that change happens by listening and then starting a dialogue with the very people who are doing something that you don't necessarily believe is right. And whenever we can, we must speak for those that cannot speak for themselves.
Very good. Mark?
I was talking about the elephant in the room a little bit earlier. I'm going to give you the example of Canada. In Canada, the literacy rate, so the ability of reading and writing of the population is just a little bit under 100%, which is comparable to many countries. However, that's the elephant. In my opinion, the low literacy rate of 48% of the Canadian population, so half of the population, is incredibly high. So what is literacy? We always, as communicator, we always forget what is it. But when we communicate, we try to create meaning, useful meaning. And if we forget in our strategic thinking the literacy problematic, in French, problematic of literacy, I think we miss the point of strategic communication. Because if in Canada, as I mentioned, 48%, half of the population have difficulties to understand complex understanding, that's the key word, understanding complex messages, I think it's an important issue for all strategic communication across the world. So there will be also, beside that, there will be a problem of strategic myopia on the part of communicators who, in my opinion, tend to project their own level of literacy, including myself, most often I, to the population. I'm going to give you an example. 2 years ago, I had an international funded project on COVID, and I made a presentation in Montreal to the public health expert on that matter. And I point out that the lowest degree in the room, the lowest degree obtained at the meeting was a master's degree. So everyone over the table had a master's degree, PhD, post-PhD, and were decided what were going to be the message of COVID and the pandemic to convince all kind of population, forgetting that half of the population had a small degree of literacy. So for me, the impact of literacy over the vulnerable population, mainly and mostly for vulnerable population, cannot understand all the complex information communicated, especially in the anxiety-provoking context. And understanding, as a scholar, the concept of literacy, but also for a communication expert, is a key element for optimized strategy. Thank you very much.
Very good. Stephen.
Well, I think if we really do value dialogue, and I think that we all do, we have to recognize that we are sharing the risk with different communities. That, just as Mark was saying, that we're not above it. And our experiences, although they are different in many ways, they are also the same. And starting from that perspective is valuable when constructing messages or information campaigns, because it recognizes that we're in this together. And much of my research recently has stressed the idea of balancing the concepts of self-efficacy and system efficacy, meaning that people want to know what they can do to respond to a crisis event. How do they protect themselves? How do they protect their loved ones? But also, they want to know what other people around them, what other organizations or agencies are also doing on their behalf. And so it's when we have this understanding of both what is expected of me and what do I expect of others that we start to have a more nuanced understanding of how that we can act together to solve problems. And I think that really promotes the idea of dialogue at that level. But if I might be so bold as to share what I consider to be a hard truth when we're dealing with disinformation and misinformation, that we must treat dissenters with respect and with compassion. And what do I mean by that? People in democracies have the right to be incorrect. They have the right to be wrong. And that does not make them bad. It does not make them evil actors. And so we must always approach people from the perspective that they're trying to get it right, but they might not have the right information or might not have the experience that allows them to process that information in a way that we would hope that they would. And so to meet people where they're at, I think it's important to acknowledge the apparent correctness of what we consider to be the wrong interpretation before we push to correct that perspective and to share a different or new way of thinking about a particular problem. And keeping that in mind, really, I believe, helps us to create a mind frame where we do have a shared understanding of how to engage a problem together.
Okay, very good. Karina?
I know we're out of time, so I'll be short. Just as maybe as a sum up of all the solutions and the recommendations that we had in this panel, and picking up from what the panelists said, I would say that it's important to have in mind to empower people to fight disinformation and to give them the tools and the techniques for that. And this strategy of empowering people should be done, I think, through memorable events and through memorable stories, because they will learn how to fight disinformation, how to spot, how to fact check if they are in the middle of a story and if they are part of all the representations that come along with all these. And I would also underline here the huge and key role that media literacy has in building our resilience and in helping people be equipped and prepared in order to identify what is false and what is truth in the information that they receive, and how to, let's say, interpret and depict whatever are the communication materials that they receive. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank our panelists for helping us follow the wisdom of Rumi and pursue novel ideas that address emerging problems. I also want to follow the lead of my panelists and thank the Directorate of Communication and the Republic of Turkey for inviting us to participate. And thank you for your time. Good job.